Welcome to Keep Hustling, where we are going past the why to get to the how. I'm your host, the always hustling Aaron Gordon, aka NY Risk Advisor, aka Mr. #Keep Hustling. In this podcast, we will be diving deep into the professional and personal successes of our guests to find out how they hustled through the most difficult times in their life and their development to achieve the success they've gotten to today. So buckle up for what hopes to be an amazing ride. And of course, now and always, keep hustling. Welcome to Keep Hustling with my guest, Jeff Teschke. Jeff, thank you for being here.
You got it, Aaron. I'm excited to be here.
I have to begin. For those of you watching on video, this is very important because I believe that credit goes where credit is due. When I think back to how, sit back in your chair, Jeff. When I think back to how Keep Hustling came to be, the first time I ever saw the term used together was on a t-shirt sent to me by Jeff. I don't want to know how many years ago that was. It was hanging in my office for a while. He didn't run with it, and we'll get into the things that Jeff did do. But I did endeavor to keep hustling and have made that the mantra and the title of this podcast. So really, Jeff, you deserve the credit on Keep Hustling, and I will make one promise to you, and that is that when we do release, please God, in the near future, stay tuned, listeners, to the Keep Hustling merch line. I will make sure you get a bunch of merch because you deserve it, because you have the OG t-shirt. So
I appreciate it. From there. This is definitely a vintage shirt at this point. One of the original Forge 3 shirts. I think it was maybe the first shirt that we ever printed. And I, to your point, I have no idea how many years ago this was, but I love to see you using it and going forward with it. I didn't invent this. So,
yeah. So I before we get into like the regular meat and potatoes of the podcast, I have to ask you, like, because this is the Keep Hustling podcast, what made you print that on a t-shirt for your company?
So that actually goes back early days with Forge 3. So I remember we were working with a lot of small, mid-sized companies, and I would often say either forge ahead, which is where the name Forge 3 came from. A lot of people don't know that. Or keep hustling was kind of like the sign off in all of my emails. And that's eventually where it came from, was I just kept saying it over and over, with no purpose behind it other than just saying I needed something other than see you later, or sincerely, I wanted something different. And that's where it came from.
I remember vividly when we met. I don't know if you remember where we met, but I was in Wharton at the Chubb Cappy program, and you spoke, and I was like, "This guy is onto something." And we have a website for our company because of you, so I appreciate that, and I appreciate you making my life so easy. And we'll get into that. But why don't you take us back? You founded a company, subsequently sold that company, but there's a lot more probably behind the curtain that makes Jeff who Jeff is today in 2023 or 2024. Take us back to the what do we need to know about your childhood and your upbringing that kind of shaped you most to where we are today?
Sure. Yeah. I was born in Pittsburgh, and my dad worked at Chubb, big insurance company, his entire career. I think it was 33 years when it was all said and done. And I just expected, he was the first person to go to college. He had a full ride to Waynesburg College in Pennsylvania for basketball. And I just kind of assumed that's what you did. I just assumed that you worked for some company, and he did very well there. And I expected to do the same thing. And so growing up, we lived in Pittsburgh for a long time. And then my dad got transferred out to headquarters, Chubb headquarters in Warren, New Jersey at the time. And we kind of settled into the Lehigh Valley area, which is just north of Philadelphia, about an hour and 15 minutes or so. And I kind of grew up around there and went to college, University of Scranton, was working for, guess who, Chubb at that time as well, part-time. And when I graduated in 2000 now, which is nuts to even say that, Chubb said, well, here's your offer to be webmaster. I said, well, I wasn't even thinking about being an employee here. Okay, that sounds good. So I ended up working at Chubb, and ultimately for an insurance agency my dad was running called Personal Lines Insurance Brokerage, or PLI, which was eventually sold a couple years after I started to Hub International. And then my my vision of being at some company my entire career with the cufflinks and the coasters on my coffee room table, all that kind of stuff went out the window, and I was on an unemployment line, literally unemployed, not knowing what the heck I was going to do. And that was a shock to the system. And that was actually a really pivotal moment, I think, in my life, in my career. It didn't feel like it was a good thing at the time, but as it turned out, that was really probably the best thing to happen to me.
Well, that is, I don't know if I deliberately, when I've heard you speak before, or I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before. So if I have, we're gonna put it on the air here. Since you mentioned that that was your path, and then it kind of got ratcheted, or the boat was rocked. I don't know if you know, but my father, he should rest in peace, who passed away this past April, was a 60-year Chubb agent. And if you would have asked him what his most memorable moment in the insurance industry was, he would tell you that as a small agent from New York City, he kicked and screamed and banged down the door until Chubb shut down that operation because he felt that Chubb was competing with their own agents. Did you know that?
I did not know that. No, I think Chubb bought PLI.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, I think they bought the agency to learn about how agencies. It's an interesting transaction, right? So you have this big corporation, Chubb, and they bought an agency, which is a weird competitive kind of thing.
Correct. And so my father's thing on competition was let agents compete with each other, but it's impossible for you to say, as in, and we don't have to get into the weeds on insurance companies, but that agency won't have a leg up with the underwriters when they're sitting next to that person, as a person sitting, thousands of miles away. So you're welcome for that pivotal moment in your career coming. It all good. You know what? We were linked at Keep Hustling before I was even in the industry. So
we didn't know it.
So I want to just get back to that. You said that you assumed that the path was college, same corporation for many, many years, kind of move up the corporate ladder, I assume, kind of constantly evolve there. And then that's just how a career works. That is something that's very rare in 2023, 2024, and something that, I know I talk to my kids about. So you said you thought that was it. Did your father talk about that? Was it just like, this is kind of how it worked? How did you get that impression?
I think it was just assumed. I didn't know any better. I didn't know any other way. Because again, my dad was the first kid to even go to college. So otherwise, before him, his parents grew up on the south side of Pittsburgh, or the south side, as we say in Pittsburgh, and a rough area, and just very blue collar work, and which I think is where a lot of the blue collar. I really love that the hustle, if you will, of having to grind it out and go downtown and sit on a metal stool and wind electric motors. That's what my grandfather did his entire career, and coming back greasy, and you can never get the grease stains out of your overalls, but the meal was on the table, and it wasn't much, but it's all that I knew. And I didn't even probably know the word entrepreneurship, or let alone what it meant to create a company or something like that. So I kind of got just thrown off of that path, not because I wanted to or thought. It was just it was just what happened. It was a reaction to getting downsized, and me not being prepared that could even be something that happened. I always thought that a big company like a Chubb, for example, meant big time stability. And of course, now I know that's not always the case. Learned that the hard way, though.
Were you said that was a shock to the system. I imagine that it was a shock to the system, A, being unemployed, but B, I imagine that there was something there to, this is not working out the way it was assumed to. Meaning it wasn't like like I imagine that people whose parents and influences change jobs a lot, that wouldn't be as much of a shock to the system, because they might say, Okay, great. So when your company either goes under or your company gets sold or you get moved or you get demoted or you get fired, you just find another job. But like for Jeff, I assume, I don't know how old you were then, but like this is not supposed to happen. I'm supposed to just, I back this horse and this horse is supposed to take me to retirement.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I didn't really have a plan B. I just assumed that's what you did. And also, all my buddies from college did the same thing. We all did the same thing. It was, my friends were working on Wall Street right out of school and big consulting companies and those types of things. Some went into the family business, but it was just what you did. It's, you're a senior in college and you go to your counselor and they're like, well, here are the job opportunities. I'm like, well, I'm already working at Chubb and here's my offer. They're like, well, that's great. Do that. And there wasn't a lot of talk about other options or creating companies or anything other than kind of just going in that direction, which, and I know this is dated advice probably, because now, like you said, it's totally different. I asked my daughter what she wants to be when she grows up, and she's like, I want to be an entrepreneur. And she's 11. So it's a very different vibe now than it was back 20 some years ago when I was in school and fresh out of school.
100%. 100%. But I also think that there's something to, I mean, it's funny. I think it's one of my brothers who says that entrepreneur is the new fireman. Everybody says they want to be one when they're a kid, but then when push comes to shove, they all take like, a cushy job at some big firm because not all, but many of those people, nobody actually, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a fireman. And then I realized that they went into burning buildings and I was like, this is a terrible idea. So I imagine that. So take me back to the pivotal moments. You said that was the most pivotal moment in your career was when you were let go. So take us to that. Take us to that moment. You weren't exactly fired because you did anything wrong, but
No.
at the same token, you didn't have a job anymore.
Yeah, it sucked. That was the worst feeling. I remember driving into the unemployment office to get unemployment benefits. I had to go drive into New Jersey somewhere and into some beat up building and watch a VCR tape on one of those carts from like old fashioned high school. They would wheel in and they would, the video was all grainy and it was talking about how to make a resume in Microsoft Word. And I'm like, what the heck did I do to get here? I'm looking around the room. I'm like,
what did I do
feel
wrong?
like what happened is what I was thinking. And it totally sucked. And I had no idea what I was going to do. And, I remember getting unemployment benefits and I think it was every week you had to call the line and confirm that you were looking for work. And then I got my little check in the mail. And again, meanwhile, my buddies from college all have these highfalutin jobs. They're like on Wall Street and big consulting companies. And I'm sitting there saying, what, like, what do I do now? And ultimately there were a ton of, I'll call them failures because, that's kind of from a business standpoint, what you would call them. Between that period of time and realizing any kind of traction or success that people later started to see and notice with Forge 3,
Did you assume that you would go to another big corporation and just kind of start that path over?
I didn't know.
Time, or kind of, or did you see the hustle, the entrepreneur, that kind of coming through?
Yeah, I don't think I really knew at the time what the heck I was going to do. I was kind of just desperate. I didn't know. Ultimately I found and this is thanks to my dad. So one of my dad's friends was running a small software startup outside of Philadelphia. And they knew my experience with the web and websites and that sort of thing. And they said, we need somebody like Jeff there. So they ended up making me an offer. So that kind of just happened through really connections and my dad's relationship. I got into that and I was there for a couple of years. I think it was 2 years. It was not the fit for me. It was smaller. So I saw a different side of business. I think there might've been, I don't know, 12, 15 employees or something like that. But I had a lot of big ideas as the fresh kid coming in that there was a lot of resistance on implementing them. And I was like, why can't we do these cool things? And it was that kind of, it was just a very contentious environment. Respect those folks a lot. And they eventually sold the company and did fine. but I just wasn't in my zone there. And that's when on the side, it was kind of nights and weekends, I created iSpot, which was ISPOTT, which was a mobile scavenger hunt game played with cell phone cameras. And I did it I needed somewhere to put my energy that I could have some level of control. And I just created this thing and threw it out there. And then that's when, as luck would have it, Microsoft just stumbled upon it completely randomly after about 2 weeks of it being out there. And they literally picked up the phone and they just called and said, we have a campaign that we're working on with a big global brand. We'll tell you later who it is, but can we use this thing for that campaign? I was like, heck yeah. First of all, are you sure you're Microsoft? Like, who is this? Who's calling me? But it was the real deal.
Not a funny joke. The guy, your high school buddy. That's not a funny joke.
That's what I expected. I was like, Mike, is that you? Who is this? And, but ultimately so that's when I said, all right, well, geez, this creating something cool is kind of how you start these cool companies. And I guess that was easy. Look how easy this thing is. You just create a cool concept and you have a successful business. And ultimately that I learned that wasn't correct the hard way the years after this. But they ran a big campaign with Microsoft, and Sprite was the brand. And it was a heck of a thing. We had a lot of interesting experiences with that. And ultimately that ended up failing though. And the reason for that was, there are a number of things I think that went into the reason why it didn't end up working out. The Microsoft campaign was a success. That was awesome. We had people reach out constantly, like Lee Steinberg was one of them. And for those that might have seen Jerry Maguire movie, the Show Me the Money, that guy, big sports agent.
Right, yeah.
And so he reached out, his people reached out and said, we want to acquire this thing. And we were like, holy crap, this is easy, right? You just create a thing, run a big campaign, and then it gets acquired. Like, how hard is this business thing? It's super simple. And so we went back and forth to California and had meetings and went to Super Bowl parties on red carpets and with the Baldwin brothers, and just a crazy experience on big yachts and just nuts. And that fell apart. This is now public knowledge, but Lee struggled a lot at that time with alcoholism. And he was at the top of his game and had all the big NFL quarterbacks at that time, and he lost it all. And he's since now built it back up, and he represents Patrick Mahomes and a bunch of others. So he's doing just great now. But iSpot fell apart. So again, I was kind of left with pieces on the ground with no company. There was no money left because all the money that was made through the Microsoft campaign was going into expenses and hosting and travel back and forth to California and all this stuff. And I looked up and there was nothing left. And I was beat up again and didn't know what to do. So that was a heck of an experience.
That time probably more beat up. Or differently beat up, right?
Oh,
that
for
time,
sure.
You had something. It wasn't someone else's company and therefore collateral damage, for lack of a better term. This was your thing. First of all, that's a great idea. That is a great idea. Is there an app like that now? There's got to be an app like that.
Yeah, there's like Be Real is somewhat similar to it. There's really nothing. I tried to bring iSpot back. So years later, I tried to bring it back as an app because iSpot existed in a time before iPhones. It was right before the iPhone era. And it was all just text messaging, and you get an alert through a text message to find certain like thirst, bubbles, a straw, just weird things. And then you'd take pictures and send them in. And then the most creative pictures would get the most stars, points. And then there'd be a leaderboard and prizes. And it was a heck of a thing. It was a really cool concept. It was a lot of fun.
That's such a great idea.
Yeah, it's cool. I honestly still think it can work. What's that?
I think it's like the greatest like school trip to New York City. Like get on iSpot.
Yeah, like I said, I tried to bring it back, and it's a different world when I did because we had iPhones and Android phones and all that stuff and apps, and that failed as well. So I invested and tried to put, I don't know how much, it might have been $50,000 or $60,000 or something into a development team to build out the app, and It took forever. It never worked. It crashed constantly. It was just a never-ending struggle, and so that didn't work out. That didn't work out either. And you start to wonder, and if this whole thing was even meant for me to do. Maybe I just need to find some job again somewhere, and maybe it's a little bit harder to have a company and create things than I once thought it was.
I am blown away by the fact that you had that. I wasn't counting. I should have been counting from the beginning, but at least 3 or 4 times in this conversation, probably more, you have used the words of "that failed" and "that didn't work." And yet, I know, and spoiler alert, end of the story, Jeff created a company called Forge 3 that my family has been a buyer, user, partner of for, I guess it's close to 10 years now, or maybe a little less, and ended up selling the company. I assume you would call that one a success. Is that correct?
I think so. And it's not that it's a complete failure, because you do learn things through every single one of these things. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, which is why I don't have any regrets in life, because everything that you do up until this point gets you to where you are, good, bad, or indifferent. But from a business sense, if you just look at it objectively, well, when the company goes to zero and there's no more money to pay the bills and you don't know what else to do, like, it's a business failure. But I think there's always information that you can kind of take from those things.
And that is keep hustling, right? That the idea that failure ends a person or ends a journey, I think, is something that we're learning more and more. And the more I speak to people and the more I'm learning from successful individuals and entrepreneurs and business owners, is that every failure could be a bump, but there's no such thing as the end as long as you're hustling, as long as you keep going, or as long as you're saying forging ahead, as long as you said, forge ahead. And I think that your story is really that's what's incredible about, and that's what I'm learning here, is that I'll tell you the other interesting thing about this is I've known you for a number of years, and maybe when I heard you speak the first time, you might have mentioned some of those things, but I say this guy is the ultimate entrepreneur, started a company, had it for 18 years, and then sold it after growing it to a very successful endeavor. So I think that that's what we often don't see, is what's behind that curtain. And sometimes, if nothing else, we can learn that everybody has those stories, and therefore there's much more than what meets the eye. And I think that, your story is definitely one of those. So what made you start Forge 3? What made you get back in the ring? So you said you kept thinking, I want to go back. You kept thinking, maybe I should just go and get a regular corporate job. But
yeah,
you did. So why?
So this entire, even with iSpot happening, and when I was working at the small software company, I was doing some web work on the side, which was really what Forge 3 was. I just created it to have a company so that I could invoice people. There wasn't much thought put into it beyond that. So it always kind of existed there for that purpose. And after some of these things came and went, and there were other things too. We tried to get into IT services, and I brought in a former Chubb colleague to help with that. And that was really rough, trying to scale that. I was getting calls at 3 a.m. that the surgery center computer was crashing. And it's like, all right, well, I'm not going to do that. So then got rid of that, sold that to my former colleague, just the book of business to him. And he ran with that. Created something called Safe Stacks, which was my first attempt at a SaaS product, as software as a service. It was a secure place to keep usernames and passwords and IT equipment and license codes and all that kind of stuff. The equivalent now might be like 1Password or LastPass, those kinds of things. And that didn't work out. Put a ton of effort into that and money into that. And I don't think we got more than like 13 subscribers paying like, $7 a month or something. So that sucked. And I met Monica Barakat, who eventually became my COO and good friend, and really a really important piece of the puzzle going forward for me, and continues to be a great friend. I met her at a Panera Bread, just a weird coincidence kind of a thing. She was meeting with somebody that I was meeting after her, and we bumped into each other. And we tried to create content things where we would create content for businesses on bean bags for your office, 10 ways to use bean bags in your office. We were like a content farm. We're trying to create content, and it went on, but we were still doing some web stuff that entire time, even though we're taking these swings for the fences and nothing's working. We're striking out constantly. She started to be there during this transition to being kind of niched down. So we basically took what we were doing with the web stuff. She was a subcontractor. Then there were more subcontractors. Then eventually like the first employee. But we were just building websites for people because I needed a way to make money. That's where this came from. It was just it was desperate way that's what I knew to do. So I was going to do that until I figured something else out. And that's really where Forge 3 got its very early days. And we were a very generalized company, just building websites and eventually doing digital marketing for all kinds of businesses, nothing specific, until 2016. 2016, I was just frustrated, man. So it was 2004 to 2016. I'm looking at my like tax returns and I just see like a flat line. Like I'm not going anywhere. It was fine. It supported the lifestyle and the family eventually and all that kind of stuff. But I'm like, what the heck am I doing wrong? I'm reading like, these articles about the $4 billion man. And, this woman created this incredibly successful company. I'm like, how hard, what am I missing? I can't even get my line to go up a little bit. And almost out of desperation, I said, all right, guys, it was me and maybe two other people or something. They were probably both subcontractors. I said, we're just going to go off site. And we rented a free space at the Capitol Blue building because it was free. There was a yoga class happening outside the windows. So we had sweaty people posing in all kinds of interesting positions right outside our window as we're trying to meet. And I said, let's take what we were doing with websites. We were already doing a lot with insurance agencies because of my history with Chubb, and my friends came out of that, and I just started to know people. And I just said, we need to create something that we can scale better. We're going to call it Active Agency. Here's what we need to do. Here are the buckets of content. We can create some cool stuff, and let's see what happens. And that was the beginning of it. And then it's kind of the beginning of what the story that most people know now, right? Because most people know of me and Forge 3 and Active Agency from that period on, because that's when things took off. It became a very clear story. You could see the success, you could see the trajectory of things all the way up until last year when the company was acquired.
I'm going to ask a very direct question, and you can plead the fifth if you want. What was your dad saying through all these ups and downs?
That's a good question. What was he saying? I think initially when I was still working, when I took that big step to do iSpot, because that was really the transition from working somewhere to being on my own. I think both he and my mom were probably nervous about it because, again, it's not the world they came from. I saw success in other people doing that. I didn't know how to do it, but I had a little bit of confidence, and I think they probably had confidence in what I could do. But my guess is those early conversations were like, well, yeah, you could do it, but maybe there's another, job or opportunity that you'll find too. Or it was very uncertain times. They were always super supportive. Love my parents, great family, great upbringing. But my guess is there was some apprehension for sure.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is I'm saying me, and no, I wasn't excluding your mother, but when we painted the original picture, it was, the ultimate corporate person who, by the way, not just did the corporate thing, but did very well at it. It's not like he stayed at a low-level job his whole life and just barely made ends meet. He did well and was able to move up in the quote-unquote normal, traditional path. And here's his son, who kind of started like that, and then just is throwing random darts at the wall, and presumably none of them are sticking very well. So I can imagine that, but I also imagine that they saw your drive. Those around you saw the drive and said, he's not going to stop.
Yeah,
I always had sitting in the basement eating pizza.
No, I always had this, I don't know where this comes from, but I always had this drive, and I don't know why. I don't know why. I don't know where it comes from. I really don't. I don't quit. I just don't. It's not like, it's not because I read a bunch of motivational books and quotes and that keeps me going. It just, I don't need any of that. It's just I like solving the problems. I like challenges. And for me, I think it was that it's probably the hook of the challenge of it, of trying to figure it out, that initially intrigued me enough to keep going through it, even though it was absolute hell. I mean, these early years were the least enjoyable thing like you can imagine. Um, but eventually you turn the corner, and my guess is, I don't a lot of people, I think, quit prematurely. And it could be, you could say, well, if you quit after 10 years of doing it, is that premature? In my case, yeah, it would have been, because we didn't turn the corner until what, 12 years after Forge 3 was a company, right?
So how do you keep going when you realize that you have to hang it up? Meaning you did shut some things down. And I'm not saying that you quit. You kind of, you were quitted, for lack of a better term, but like, the game ended. You got to the last level and the game ended.
Yeah.
So how do you then, I get that you keep going, don't quit when you're in something, but then how do you decide to shut it down and start something new if that's your mentality?
I think it just comes from me. I tend to be an optimistic person. I don't know. I look at things as, and there are benefits to it and downsides to thinking optimistically all the time, I guess. But but I'll take it. I think the pros far outweigh the cons. I think it's just the optimism. It's like, all right, well, that didn't work, but I still have this other thing, and maybe if I did this, that would work. It just comes back to that. I just always believe that there's something better ahead. The best days are ahead. They're not behind, they're ahead. And for whatever reason, that ends up keeping me going. I remember I was on the way, I was commuting to the small software company before I created iSpot. And I was doing websites on the side and nights and weekends and all that. And I would do calls. It was an hour commute each way. And I would do calls in the morning and calls at night with clients. And my one client, he said something I'll never forget, because he said, why are you still working there? I said, well, I don't know. I don't know. I just felt like I don't know. That's what I do. And he said, Jeff, you can figure it out. He's like, what's the worst that's going to happen? If it doesn't work out, you can always go back. And for whatever reason, I can hear that just like it was yesterday. And it's probably 20 years ago at this point. But that's true. It's like, what's the worst case scenario? I'll figure something out. I can go get a job somewhere if it doesn't work out. But I also don't want to have regrets if I don't try it. And as luck would have it, that's when iSpot happened and all of that. Yeah.
And that is keep hustling. That's saying that my goal here and what I've learned and is that if you realize that you can figure it out, you will figure it out. I don't think that there is any person, barring the severely physically and mentally ill. So I'm not talking about those unfortunate cases and those people who, that I think that you could figure it out. It might require a pivot. It might require however you want to look at it, but every person can figure it out as long as you keep going and keep hustling. And I think that your story is one that shows us that, because you kept going, and then you had this thing on the side. And I bet, because that's how entrepreneurship works, that when you started the other things as Forge 3 was still in its infancy, the other side hustles, quote unquote, you actually thought that Forge 3 would not be your key to success and that one of those would take off. And yet, in the end of the day, as long as you kind of just keep the boat moving in that direction, that's how the success comes. Ultimately, right. It might take time. Some people it's shorter than others. Some people it's easier than others. But
yeah, and there's a certain level of desperation, I think, that you feel that you're I felt like I was backed into a corner and I didn't have any other way to do it. It's when, I know you come from an immigrant family, as do I, and a lot of others listening to this. And I was listening to one of your previous shows, and you talk about being tough. Well, if you're coming over on a boat and you got a shirt on your back, well, what are you going to do? Like, your back's against it. You have no other option. So if you compare this quote unquote desperation that I'm talking about, it's nothing compared to that. Right. Even though there's this internal motivation to want to get out of the corner and move somewhere. And I always admired the Inc. 500 list and all these cool companies doing. I just always wanted to be on something like that. I didn't know how to get there, but that alone was enough to just keep me motivated and pushing forward to eventually realize some level of success later on.
Jeff, you deserve the t-shirt. You deserve the mantra. You are the very definition of keep hustling in my view, from a professional standpoint, to keep pushing through in your personal life when all that stuff is going on. So really, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for being so open and honest about the failures that we're calling bumps in the road and not real failures, but those challenges that you face. We have a closing tradition on this podcast where we ask our guests to leave us with their lifetime or current favorite motivational or inspirational quote. The floor is yours.
So it's a really simple one, but it hits home for me, and that's progress is perfection. Progress is perfection. And I tend to be a perfectionist. I like things to be just perfect. But I've learned through this whole journey that can get in the way of progress. So it's a reminder to me that as long as you're making some sort of progress in some direction, whether it's up, whether it's down, whether it's just forward or back, wherever you're going, progress somewhere is what it's all about. Building the momentum, having the progress. That's perfect. You can't get much better than that.
I love that. And that means that you're hustling, and you're definitely, as I said before, a hustler. Keep hustling. The OG t-shirt, keep hustling t-shirt wearing Jeff Teschke, thank you again for being here.
Thanks, Aaron. Take care.
Remember, this has been another episode of Keep Hustling. Remember, do well by doing good, and always keep hustling. All right, hustlers, that brings us to the end of another fantastic episode. Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode. If you have any suggestions, comments, or even just want to say hello, please feel free to reach out to us on all social media platforms. We are Keep Hustling Pod. Until next time, stay curious, stay hungry, and keep hustling.